Has a very close governor's race gotten even closer? A conversation with political scientist Charles Franklin this morning on For the Record. Good morning, I'm Neil Heinen. The most recent poll showed the race between Governor Scott Walker and Democratic challenger Mary Burke to be a dead heat. Then came last week's release of documents in the John Doe investigation into Walker campaign activities. We'll look at the John Doe fallout. We'll talk about the current state of campaign laws in this country and this state, and we'll try to read a few tea leaves as I welcome to For the Record Professor of Law and Public Policy and Director of the Marquette Law School poll and regular analyst of all things political for WISC TV, Charles Franklin. Charles, thank you very much for joining me this morning.
Always good to be here. Thank you.
Despite everybody's best efforts, I think there's still a great deal of confusion about exactly the impact of the release of the John Doe investigation. How are you describing it to yourself and others?
Well, I think one of the things that's been true throughout the Doe investigation is how limited the information is that comes out. That's the whole idea
by design, right?
Behind the secrecy of it. And so with this current investigation, we've seen some public complaints from the people that are targeted and say that they are unfairly targeted. Those are the folks that filed a federal suit to stop the investigation. But it wasn't until last week that we saw the prosecutors lay out their argument. Up until then, there really had not been any public disclosure about what the prosecutor's view of the case was and who was involved. So I thought that was the really important brand new information.
Kind of unusual, right, for a Doe investigation
for that to become available this way is quite unusual. You know, the governor points out that that's an old document coming from the end of last year. That's true, but it's certainly new news to see what the prosecutor's case was.
Sure.
So it also puts the two judges' rulings, one in state court and one in federal court, in a more clear light, because their conclusions are based on the argument that the kind of advertising and political work that these independent groups were engaged in is not within the political realm that's covered by the statutes, and therefore is protected by the First Amendment. The prosecutor's argument was that when you're engaged in millions of dollars of campaign advertising, that under Wisconsin statutes and a 1999 state court ruling, that it is political and therefore does fall within the statutes. So that's the legal argument that's going on right now, is if the advertising and the political activities are not within the realm of what is technically political and therefore regulated, then it's free speech, and then you don't even get to the question of coordination. But you know, we're waiting for the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals in Chicago to rule on this. It is an issue that the U.S. Supreme Court has been shifting its views on over the last 10 years. So there's an awful lot of legal uncertainty about this interpretation of campaign advertising.
To get to the, one of the issues here, which is to attach too much significance to the to the documents or too little significance to the documents. How do we decide to attach the relative importance to either the prosecutor's argument or the two judges' ruling, in terms of legal significance?
Well, I think the legal significance really hinges on this idea of what is political activity. And the U.S. Supreme Court has made a distinction between issue advocacy. That's when I say Joe Smith has a jobs-killing plan and it'll send jobs out of state. Clear advocacy going into campaign mode is to say Joe Smith has a jobs-killing plan that'll send jobs out of the country, so vote against Joe Smith.
Right.
And that presence or absence of vote for, vote against is where the Supreme Court has drawn the line.
Is it really a matter of those words?
Very close to it.
And not so much that the average citizen would assume that this meant vote against.
In point of fact, it is very much the use of the words that appear rather than how an average citizen might interpret an ad. I think there's plenty of evidence that average citizens don't differentiate the fine points of ads. They see that this is for somebody or against somebody, or it's pushing a perspective. But I do think there's an important thing to think a little bit about. If, you know, I want to come by your office and try to convince you of my view of something, you might think that's a First Amendment right. If I want to stand on my front lawn and speak to anybody that passes about my views, you might think that's a First Amendment right. If I and 99,000 of my friends want to show up at the Capitol to express a political viewpoint, you might think that's protected. So the arguments from the side that wants basically unlimited issue advocacy is that it's simply a matter of expanding free speech to include the modern medium of campaigns or advertising, really, to say this is what we believe, and as long as I stay short of saying expressly vote for or against someone or close synonyms to that, then all I'm doing is expressing my point of view, and that's protected by the First Amendment. Yeah. And I think if you think about this, you see how easy it is to go from where I think almost all of us would agree that I can come talk to you about my beliefs, to I can get together with a bunch of my friends to express my beliefs. But does that go to spending millions of dollars on the airwaves to express that view? And that's really the debate that the U.S. Supreme Court is having. From the beginning of campaign finance law, especially in the 1970s following Watergate, the court said the reason you can regulate campaign contributions is because of the potential for corruption or the appearance of corruption. But over the years, they've seen less and less that falls into that category of potentially corrupting activity. And more and more, they've seen that free speech is involved in these things. So there's clearly a strong pushback from the sides that see money as inherently corrupting, that sees if I run $1 million of advertising that supports a candidate, isn't that obvious that I've done that? But the court has kept this sharp line between express advocacy, where I say vote for or against, versus issue advocacy, which they see as protected.
All right, I'm going to ask you for a little more help on that and the relationship to Citizens United when we come back right after this. My guest this morning, Marquette University Law School professor and political scientist Charles Franklin, and we're talking about the release of the John Doe documents and the Walker investigation and the reaction to all of that. And I want to just what gets tossed out sort of shorthand a lot is the Citizens United decision in the Supreme Court, which in fact redefined, I think, campaign finance in this country. But is there a direct relationship there between that ruling and what we're seeing played out here in this
Well,
discussion?
Certainly some of the aftermath of Citizens United, in terms of this notion that speech is protected, and that includes issue advocacy, and issue advocacy itself is remarkably broad. That, I think, is really the underlying movement and shift in the court's views that's been going on at least since McCain-Feingold was passed and a bunch of litigation that largely dismantled McCain-Feingold. So I do think there's this real shift in perspective, and the notion that money is intrinsically corrupting largely swept to the side in favor of First Amendment speech protections.
Advocacy being defined as speech. Money buys opportunities for speech. I mean, that's
right.
kind of how we have to look at that. Is that right?
Well, that's the argument for people that would like to see campaign finance largely unregulated, at the very least for these purposes of issue advocacy. But the issue advocacy is so closely related to campaign goals, to helping a candidate or hurting their opponent, that for a sort of common sense view, these things are clearly political. But for the way the Supreme Court has tried to consider, where can I limit my ability or your ability to speak on an issue of public importance? The court now is saying that is more important than the fact that my speech like that might help or hurt a candidate.
So eliminating then, I mean, if we take issue advocacy out of the equation, does the Constitution still provide guidelines on money in campaigns?
Yes, up to a point. And this is where the court has not yet moved to say you or I can give an unlimited dollar amount directly to a candidate. So the contribution limits for us to give to candidates remain in effect. It's that we can get together with our friends independent of the campaign and spend largely whatever we want on advocating for our views. One of the things that's at stake with the current John Doe investigation is the question of whether there can be strong coordination between a campaign and these independent groups. You know, in 2012, Stephen Colbert did a number of very humorous examples on his show about how close the connections can be between supposed independent groups and a campaign, and yet still be perfectly acceptable within the law. And again, that goes back to the common sense notion that these things don't seem very different and the separation is very minor indeed, versus the notion that there's one area, I'm limited in how much I can give to the candidate directly, but another area where I can spend an awful lot of money that pretty clearly works to their advantage.
I want to talk about the governor's race a little bit later, but just in terms of previous polling that you've done, have you ever gotten any indication that the public judges candidates one way or the other based on their sort of campaign finance approach?
Not very much. This is an area where usually a pretty substantial percentage of the public favors limiting money in politics and sees it as a bad thing, just as a general principle. That almost never extends to being willing to take money away from my candidate. And in the modern era, it's hard to imagine a statewide campaign that doesn't need substantial resources. But if public funding of campaigns is now completely off the table, where do you get those resources? So there's not much evidence that voters reward or punish candidates for how they get their money. Every campaign talks about money coming from out of state, for example. Right. I think there's very little evidence that that matters very much.
Yep. There was one editorial, I think it was maybe the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel, that basically said Republicans and Governor Walker, be careful what you wish for, suggesting the obvious, which is if this is indeed the law of the land, Democrats and others will adapt it as well, and there's money out there for them, and we just raise the arms race here.
And I think it's fair to say that both sides have embraced this with independent expenditure groups. In 2012, there was certainly no partisan side to this in the sense that both sides had their independent groups and their independent expenditures. You know, and President Obama's campaign was in 2012 was the first $1 billion with a B presidential campaign. Some from his direct resources, some from independent groups. So I don't think there's any stopping this. The question is, how or do you still regulate it at all versus essentially moving to the Wild West, where you may still limit the direct contributions to candidates, but independent groups can raise and spend as much as they want. The source of their money need not be disclosed under some regulatory circumstances. And the open question, I think, is the degree of coordination that's permissible. That, I think, remains one of the gray areas. And if this case moves forward, and it may or may not, but that will be one of the issues, I expect, of what are the limits to coordination.
Yeah. Well, I would think that another component of this would be how the candidates explain this to the voters. And we're going to talk about that when we come back right after this. The release of the documents in the John Doe investigation into the Governor Scott Walker campaign were released this past week, one of the biggest stories of the week, and Marquette University professor of law and political science, Charles Franklin, is with me this morning to talk about the case. Okay, strictly from a pollster's position, if you could, would you anticipate that this would have an impact on the governor's race?
So we haven't asked about the current investigation, but in 2012, we asked 7 different times about the first Doe investigation. And what we found was the public was pretty evenly split on it, but split sharply on partisan lines. So 3/4 of Republicans said that was just more politics. 3/4 of Democrats said it was something really serious. Independents split 48 to 44. And so I think it is likely that we will see a similar kind of sharp partisan division in the understanding and interpretation of this. If you go all the way back to Watergate, for example, we saw partisan divisions in the perception of how serious Watergate was, up until the point that the evidence became so overwhelmingly one-sided that opinions started to shift. So I think what we see in the current case is both sides have arguments for why this is just politics or why it's serious. The situation in the courts remains to be resolved by the Seventh Circuit and perhaps some other appeals. So I think absent some kind of further movement on that, it's very likely that we continue to see the world through our partisan lenses.
Okay. Nothing in the most recent poll, which I think some thought was a little surprising in how closely the race got so quickly, that would suggest that this particular story would have a significant impact.
Well, anytime you're as close as we're seeing it, we saw a dead tie among registered voters. Walker was ahead by 3, but inside the margin of error among likely voters. So I think the point is a close race inside the margin of error. Whenever you're in a close race like that, clearly it doesn't take very many people to move to have an impact. But I think based on our polling in the past, it will be interesting if we see any kind of one-sided response to this rather than people seeing what they want to see. But we'll be doing our next poll in mid-July, so we'll find out at that point whether there's been any shift and what the reaction has been.
Yeah, and strategically, I mean, just in the short time since this has happened, challenger Mary Burke has kind of not said too much about it. Governor Walker has said a little bit and has said it's over, basically. What would you expect in terms of their response? And more importantly, Charles, what will citizens expect of these candidates to talk about this issue?
Well, I think one of the questions is, will people really see this as a critical element?
Right.
And in general, if candidates don't talk about something as important, voters usually don't spontaneously say it's important. It's not always true, but it's often true. So I think a lot depends on which way the campaigns choose to go. But part of it is also things that are completely outside of their control, and that's what the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals decides to do. That also depends on what may happen if the case comes back to the state. So I think there's an unknown and uncontrollable aspect that goes beyond the candidate's control. But there's also the question of what do you think is more powerful? Is the jobs issue something that Burke would rather campaign on, or is it the John Doe that she would like to campaign on?
And in fact, there have already been news stories suggesting that jobs could be an even bigger issue for Walker than John Doe.
Certainly when we ask people what are important questions in the state, what are important issues, jobs in the economy still remain at the top. We saw in the 2012 recall some effort by Mayor Barrett to talk about the John Doe investigation then.
Right.
It didn't seem to move things. So I think there is ample reason to focus on other issues that have been around. And if we think about what issue will still be important in November, I think we're very confident that jobs in the economy, the state budget, taxes in the state, all of those things are still going to be part of voters' considerations. Whether this Doe investigation remains front and center or whether it's receded to the background, I think depends on the courts and depends on the campaign.
In the minute we have left, Charles, indeed, in this past week, there was another release of job numbers, and from one of the more respected sources of job numbers that were not good for the state and would probably not be good for Governor Walker. When does he start running out of time?
Well, in terms of the jobs reports, we may get, or we will get, one more of those very high quality updates, but the basic point can't change just in the time that's left, which is the state has consistently performed in the mid-30s out of the 50 states. So that's basically at the bottom of the top 2/3, so below the average. Now, the question is, do voters really care about that? We have evidence that they do. What effect does it have? And does the governor, talking about things are much better than they were when I took over, convince people of that? Or do Democrats, Mary Burke, convince voters that we really are falling short and the governor's performance is part of that reason? That's the debate.
I look forward to having you back after the July poll.
Thank you.
Charles, thanks very much. We're going to come back and wrap up For the Record right after this. My thanks to Professor Charles Franklin. Next week on For the Record, we'll take a look at the important work and new facilities of youth services. Join us then. We'll see you next Sunday on For the Record.